It's 4:05, so I guess we'll get started. So good afternoon, and welcome to our Heterodox conversation on the topic, how does EDI relate to merit? I'm Jeff Horseman. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry here at Laurier, and I'm co-chair of the Laurier Heterodox Academy campus community, affectionately known as Laurier HXA, along with my co-chairs Will McNally and Michael Pavlin, both of Laurier's business school here. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Heterodox Academy for generously sponsoring this event. It's allowed us to bring in some very high caliber speakers from international locales. We're very grateful for that. I'd also like to thank Laurier for making this space available to us. For those who don't know, I should also mention a little bit about Heterodox Academy and our campus community here. So, Heterodox Academy was founded about a decade ago to advance the principles of open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement to improve higher education and academic research. Laurier HXA was founded about a year ago as part of a campus community program. There are now about 50 campus communities, mostly in North America, I think one in the UK, and there are 6 in Canada. We've hosted events with a variety of speakers, including lawyer Lisa Bildy, Professor Bruce Party. So if you're interested, you can view these talks on our YouTube channel. We've also recently started a Substack, which you can see, where is it? Here, laurierhxa.ca, where you can get more information and keep up to date with what we're up to. So I'd also like to note that we've got this screening of The Coddling of the American Mind that will be happening next week, so all of you are welcome to attend. So as I mentioned, the topic of today's conversation is, how does EDI relate to merit? Now, this may surprise some members of the public who've come here, but this is a very controversial topic on campus. Even asking this type of question can get people into trouble. So I myself have been called into the dean's office a few times for trying to facilitate this type of conversation. And according to the administration, EDI is not debatable. The presidents of Laurier and the University of Waterloo, in a recent op-ed, asserted that, quote, removing barriers, which is code for race-based hiring, does not come at the expense of excellence. This puts a chill on the conversation. For example, a colleague, a tenured professor, mentioned to me that they weren't brave enough to come to this event. Now, most aren't so forthright, they've got other things to do today. But nonetheless, Heterodox Academy has generally been successful in at least providing a space for some people to feel comfortable to engage in such questions. So how does Heterodox do this? Well, perhaps what distinguishes these conversations is the approach and purpose. As shown by the HXA Way slide here, we focus on the process of academic inquiry, not on opinions. Our speaker pair will surely disagree on many things, but this isn't about identifying a winner and a loser. Instead, we want to highlight how it is that scholars investigate their topic and how they reach informed conclusions. Using evidence. The goal is to reveal the process of discovery and reasoning that lead to a conclusion. Of course, at the end of this conversation, you very naturally will likely be more persuaded by one side or the other, but we hope you learn about academic inquiry and continue to ask questions and engage in further exploration. Especially to the students out there, it is your right and your duty to seek out and understand both sides of a topic. Never let anyone try to tell you that a topic is settled or beyond debate. That's a power move designed to stop critical thought. This is why we want everyone here to understand the guidelines, including the HXA Way. These guidelines are not just for our speakers, but for everyone, including me. When we ask questions or challenge ideas, we need to use evidence. And we also must be charitable, humble, and constructive. So before introducing our speakers, I'd like to outline the format for our conversation here. So this will include 3 parts. So part one, each speaker will talk for about 15 minutes, walk us through the evidence for their position. And then the next 15 minutes or so, the speakers will engage in conversation and ask each other questions. And then in part three, we'll open it up to audience questions. So we're going to use something called Slido. I'll put up a slide with a QR code. If you have a phone, you can just put your QR code up, and you can type in questions, and you can upvote questions, and then we'll use that to engage questions. And finally, before you leave, we'll put up a QR code for an audience survey that'll only take a minute or so from Heterodox Academy. Okay, so now to introduce our speakers. So Paolo Gaudiano holds advanced degrees in aerospace engineering and neuroscience, and likes to joke that he'd already done rocket science and brain surgery before turning to a really complex problem: how to convince business leaders that they can make more money by creating more inclusive organizations with happier and more diverse employees. Paolo is a co-founder of Laurier, a DEI tech company that helps organizations become more successful by measuring inclusion, and ARC, a nonprofit focused on DEI research. A former tenured professor at Boston University, Paolo is currently an adjunct at NYU's Stern School of Business and chair of the annual Diversity and Inclusion Research Conference. A sought-after public speaker with 2 TEDx talks, Paolo is the author of the 2024 book, Measuring Inclusion, and a regular Forbes contributor on DEI. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including a Moonshot House Fellowship from the Kravis Center for Social Impact, a Young Investigator Award from the Office of Naval Research, and a Neuroscience Fellowship from the Sloan Foundation. Eric Kaufman is a professor of politics at the University of Buckingham in the UK, where he directs the Center for Heterodox Social Science. Eric just this year started a popular online course called Woke: The Origins, Dynamics, and Implications of an Elite Ideology, which is unique among university courses worldwide in that it empirically and analytically studies the Western cultural left and its accompanying system of wokeness, which he defines as the sacralization of minority identity. Eric has a new book as well. It's on this topic called The Third Awakening, which comes out on May 14th on Amazon. Okay, so Eric is going to be speaking first, so please join me in welcoming Eric Kaufman to the stage.
Fine, okay. Great. Well, thanks, Jeff, and thanks to Heterodox Academy and to Waterloo. And I just want to, so in this talk, what I'm going to try and do is sort of bring this to first principles, because I want to have a sort of first principles discussion about some of the assumptions that underlie DEI, so the sort of philosophical assumptions. And I'll also bring in some data, because I'm a quantitative political scientist, and it's very hard for me not to throw up some data, so I'll do that as well. In his 1961 dystopic novel, Harrison Bergeron, Kurt Vonnegut wrote about a society that wouldn't tolerate any kinds of inequality of outcome between people of different intelligence, athletic ability, and looks. So he talked about a world in which intelligent people had to wear transmitters that would sort of emit noises in their brain so they couldn't use their brain power. And beautiful actresses who had to wear disfiguring masks, and sort of the hero of the story rips this all off and gets killed in the end. But the point of that kind of a dystopic novel, and more recently we've got Lionel Shriver's Mania, which talks about this vogue for mental parity, in which again outcomes are going to be distributed equally by mental ability. So we need to equalize on the basis of intelligence. And I would define this as a form of cultural socialism. So it's not about everybody of different classes, upper class, lower class, getting the same amount of money as in economic socialism, but this is a cultural sort of non-economic form of socialism, except the categories that are sacralized are intelligence, appearance, and athletic ability for Vonnegut. Now, I don't think we have that system in place, but we do have a form of cultural socialism in place that is applied to the categories of race, gender, and sexuality. Different categories, but a very similar principle. I mean, we can look at the operation of cultural socialism in other ways too. Imagine a race in which everybody had to finish at the same time, so fast runners had to leave later than slow runners. Everybody got a prize, and so on. So you get equality of outcome. But this is not about economic socialism, but sort of non-economic forms of socialism. And along the way, what you sacrifice is the meaning of the race, the freedom of top athletes to excel, beauty, freedom, creativity, truth. And also authoritarian measures, as in Vonnegut's novel, are very necessary in order to enforce equal outcomes. So you have to hobble those who have, just through luck of the draw, been given looks or athletic ability. And of course, we see in economic socialism the excesses under Mao, Pol Pot, Stalin, etc., a kind of immiseration of society. So in order to achieve economic equality, you arrive at a society that has weak human flourishing and immiserization. And so egalitarian extremism is a problem. So equity taken to an extreme is negative for human flourishing. But that doesn't mean equality is a bad principle. In moderation, actually, equality is a really good thing and has clearly played a very important role in history. The welfare state, not letting people die in the street, equality of access to education, equal rights. There have been a lot of very good things that have come out of egalitarianism. So the problem we actually have is a problem of overreach and overshooting on equality. My point is that what we want to do is optimize the level of equality in society, not too much, not too little, for human flourishing, or for optimal cultural utility. My problem with EDI is it seeks to maximize as an absolute value equality rather than to optimize subject to constraints and trade-offs with other competing values, and there are competing values. We saw with communism very much that people, in the West, we never adopted it. We adopted a mixed capitalist system. We took some of the good out of equality. We came to a trade-off that was utility improving for society. And now we have debates between the left and the right, should tax and spend be a little higher, a little lower, but it's within a relatively tight band. We're not getting too many people who say we want a command and control system with only one department store. Okay, so while economic egalitarianism has been moderated in our sort of left liberal dispensation, I would argue that cultural forms of equality have not got any guardrails on the left. So what we're actually seeing is an extremism on cultural equality, no real barriers to going past an optimum point. So we're supposed to maximize equality, no race gaps, no gender gaps, etc., on cultural criteria, and anything less than perfect equality represents an outrage. We don't find people mandating equal outcomes, for example, for academic jobs on the basis of whether your parents were academics, even though we know some studies suggest that people with academic parents are as much as 25 times more likely to be represented in academia. But that's not something that we're going to equalize. We're not going to have quotas for people whose parents were academics and for whose parents were not academics. But yet, when it comes to race and gender, we want quotas and targets and timetables. We also, by the way, don't care about differences within race, say between, if you go to the Ivy League, you'll find that a lot of the black students come from an immigrant black background, West Indian, West African, for example, with American black being dramatically underrepresented. That's not deemed to be a problem. Likewise, if Jews are heavily overrepresented in the faculty, which they are, at least amongst older age groups, as much as 10 times overrepresented, that is not something that we seek to sort of level down in the name of equity. So there are certain categories that have become sacred, that have become the fixation of equity. Now, I don't think that this is a sort of self-evident. It's not self-evident that we would be focusing on race and gender. You can look at a society like Lebanon and Northern Ireland. The relevant category there is different. In Northern Ireland, recruitment into the police force is 50% Protestant, 50% Catholic. The relevant category there is something different than what it is, for example, under the EDI regime here. So we can have different categories. The ones that seem to be elevated politically and ideologically are race, gender, and sexuality, the Trinity. Okay. So in terms of, it's also the case that it exacts a very high cost. So very clearly, if you're going to hire on the basis of quotas, you're going, if you don't have enough suitably qualified, say, Indigenous or Black applicants, you've actually got to lower the bar, and we've seen that in the Harvard affirmative action case, where the entry-level requirements are much lower for African Americans, for example, compared to Asians. And so that could hit, well, very much does hit the idea of equal treatment and merit. And so there is a tension then between equal outcomes and merit, I would argue. So, but I don't just want to talk about egalitarianism and the left. I also want to talk about humanitarianism, which many would assume, God, you know, surely we want to maximize empathy and humanitarianism. We can't have too much of that. But actually, like egalitarianism, I'll make the case that even humanitarianism we can go too far on. And I'll just try and illustrate that a bit later on. So caring for the weak and empathizing for them, actually you can go too far on. And many people don't quite understand that. There's a book called Against Empathy by Paul Bloom, the Yale, I think he's an ethicist, but it's a very important read and draws attention to a lot of the excesses that can arise from extremism in terms of humanitarianism. Now, of course, humanitarianism has brought great improvement to our society. You think of the ending of cruel punishments, 15-hour workdays, cruelty to animals. All of these things are an outcome of the success of the humanitarian movements in pushing against those egregious outcomes. So it's done a lot of good, like egalitarianism. It's done a lot of good, but it can go too far. So at what point do we know when we've hit diminishing returns and we've actually got to sort of move back and rebalance away from something that's moving in the direction of extremism and immiserization, the way that, for example, communism moved in that direction? So how is it then that humanitarianism can go too far? Well, as Bloom notes, the question is with empathy is, who do we have empathy for? The criminal or their victim? Trans women or women who don't want biological males in women's sports and women's spaces? The interests of minorities, certain minorities in affirmative action, or the interests in the majority not to be discriminated against and to be treated equally? Whose claims? These are really clashes of rights, and yet often they are simply framed as being nice and being empathetic, full stop, without actually considering the trade-offs involved. There's also the problem, of course, of empathy directed at one group may mean that you are less empathetic to another group. There's a study by Aaron Cooley, a social psychologist, that shows that when you prime people about white privilege, they become less sympathetic to poor white people and their struggles. And so we have a problem with empathy, and it also conflicts with other values such as freedom of speech and the pursuit of truth. So if you get a gender-critical feminist on campus, if you allow them to speak, and that's not very nice, i.e. it's if you're empathizing with trans people and you get a gender-critical speaker, and that makes people upset, maybe you shouldn't allow that speaker onto campus. If you're really a humanitarian extremist, you simply ban the speaker from coming. So there is a tension between humanitarianism, especially as we move into the psychological realm of emotional safety and self-esteem, and the pursuit of truth that a university should stand for. Certain truths may be uncomfortable, but true. And if we're mainly focused on the feelings of harm that people are experiencing subjectively, then we're going to go for cancellation rather than allow that disquiet to prevail. Now, even with liberalism, by the way, and this may be heretical in a heterodox academy audience, but even liberalism can go too far. The idea that it is always better to reject tradition and commonality in favor of difference and change is simply not true. There's an optimal level of diversity, including viewpoint diversity, by the way, but there's an optimal level of diversity, not a maximal level. So when we talk about diversity just being a great thing and the more of it, the better, actually no. There's an optimal level of diversity, not too little, not too much. So if we go for too much, we actually have to wait. We actually would be better served by reducing diversity, for example, through integration, rather than simply increasing it. And there have been a number of studies, for example, looking at economic development. One of the reasons that sub-Saharan African economic development has lagged behind East Asia is these are much more ethnically diverse societies in sub-Saharan Africa. And that makes it harder to agree on where to put the road, where to put the hospitals. So James Easterly and Alberto Alessina, economists who've done work on this and showed quite powerful correlations between higher ethnic fractionalization and weaker public goods provision. Robert Putnam has done work showing, again, high diversity is correlated with lower interpersonal trust in societies. Now, you do need, obviously diversity does lead to creativity, but there's an optimal level when it starts to impact on social solidarity. And as I mentioned, even viewpoint diversity. If you're in a meeting and everyone has a different idea of how to run that meeting and they won't stop talking in a meeting, you're never going to finish. So there are countervailing principles we've got to be optimizing rather than just maximizing the letters E, D, and I. Okay, so I just want to, talk a little bit about the situation that we find ourselves in. And when you're kind of swimming with the current, it's very hard to understand the way the current's moving unless you start swimming against it. And then you realize pretty quickly what's going on. So we're living with a dominant ideology of left liberalism. It's not communism. It's not classical liberalism, and it's not, obviously, fascism. So through 2 world wars and the Cold War, the victorious ideology is left liberalism. Now, economically, we know that looks like mixed capitalism. But culturally, my argument is that with left liberalism is actually pretty extreme on culture. There's no guardrails to its left in terms of pursuing maximal egalitarianism, and I talked about race and gender gaps and affirmative action quotas. There's no limit to humanitarianism, moving into so-called emotional safety and speech codes and protecting people from psychological harm through no platforming and cancellation. And there's also no real limits on this concept of diversity. So left liberalism, I think, has an extremism problem on culture. And that underlies a lot of our problems. Okay, now hopefully they're not going to make me sign in any depth here. Okay. Okay. Okay, so I want to talk about also the importance of the emergence of the anti-racism taboo in the mid-1960s. Now, many of us will say, well, that was a good thing because racism was clearly wrong, and where it manifested in the American South in particular, you had segregation. That's all true. So we need a norm against racism, but do we really want something that is a taboo that engages our disgust reflex, essentially shuts down proportionality, shuts down the ability to set boundaries and limits on what is called racism, and encourages outrage entrepreneurs, to use Cass Sunstein's term, to stretch the definition of what is racist, because to harness that cultural power that comes from a sacred value. Shelby Steele, in his book White Guilt, talks about it because he's, as an African-American who lived through the civil rights era, he was able to feel what he calls the lines of moral power shifting. White guilt became so palpable you could see it on people, he argues, talking about this period of the 60s, the civil rights, where you had this sudden shift. And others have commented on this as well. Paul Krugman at the New York Times has also written about this. He says, what whites lost in authority, blacks gained. You cannot feel guilty about anyone without giving away power to them. And so this phenomenon of white guilt and the sacralization of race becomes extremely important. That power is then borrowed by feminist movements. It's then borrowed by gay rights movements and other movements. It's also borrowed by the left against the right. So we have the emergence of this sacralization, this source of sacredness around race, which is then borrowed by other identity movements. Incapable of having, it makes it very difficult to have nuanced conversations. It also makes it much more hazardous to talk about questions around identity. And Dennis Chong and his colleagues, both at the University of California, Los Angeles, and Berkeley, has looked at survey data in the US. Here's some data again. And the question that's been running in the General Social Survey since the early 70s asked people about tolerance for particular kinds of speakers and particular kinds of individuals teaching. And what you see is, if you start with a birth cohort, people born in the year 1900 who in those early 70s surveys would have been in their mid-70s, they were less tolerant of all kinds of speakers, communists, militarists, homosexuals, racists, all of them, than others who were younger. Now, what we see is that the lines start to rise, meaning there's greater toleration across the board for all kinds of speakers as we move through time. But then, starting around 1945 with the boomers, one of the 6 types of speakers that they're measuring, I only show 3 here for clarity, but only one of those types of speakers, the racist, people start to become less tolerant of that, such a person speaking in public. And so it starts to turn around. And as Chong and his colleagues show, it's anything around identity, race, gender, sexuality, we start to see a divergence. And that becomes more and more pronounced as we get to the cohort born in the year 2000, who would now be sort of around 24, 25. That's continued. And so we have this exceptionalism around identity where that toleration really diverges. And so what we're getting now is moral absolutism amongst the Zoomers. So instead of young people being more likely to say values are relative, morals are relative, they're now more likely to say morals are absolute, there's absolute right or wrong. So that's a big change, and it upends an entire literature. We come then to my definition of woke, which is the making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual minority groups. Vaccines, climate, and all of those debates are falling, notice that they fall outside my definition of woke. So I think trying to use woke to sort of talk about very real restrictions on the ability to talk about, say, if you're a climate skeptic or a vaccine skeptic or whatever. There's a family resemblance, but I don't think that belongs in the definition of woke. Woke is really about this. It's about the sacralization of identity. Those particular stories become very meaningful for progressives, and they become very attached to these narratives, to these particular groups, their myths and symbols. And then out of those attachments to particular movements, the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, the women's equality, feminist movement, we get a sort of fuzzy set of principles which I call woke cultural socialism. And again, it's cultural socialism, but it's not the Vonnegut, it's not about beauty and intelligence, it's about race, gender, and sexuality. And it's about 2 principles, equal outcomes, so no race or gender gaps, for example, and quotas that follow from that, and also harm protection, including emotional harm protection or emotional safety. Jonathan Haidt talks about the 2 moral foundations of equality and care harm, and that's what this corresponds to. And if we take this forward and translate it into university speak, the equality foundation is equity and diversity. That means equal outcomes by race and gender. And then inclusion is what the Care Harm Foundation refers to, which is harm protection, including emotional harm protection. And what that means is we can't create a hostile environment, therefore we can't have dangerous ideas and speakers on campus because they might upset somebody and they might lead to emotional trauma, and so we can't invite them. That's where there's a collision between inclusion and freedom of speech and truth. Okay. And so what we have then is, the difference between what occurs in the early 1990s with political correctness and speech codes and what then occurs in the 2010s with what Matthew Iglesias at Vox calls the Great Awakening, is that during the Great Awakening, social media allowed ideas that had already been on campus for decades to essentially enter the media. And so in the New York Times, we see an explosion in mentions of the term sexist and racist. And yes, that is product placement for my new book, by the way. Sorry about that. Right, so we have this awakening. My argument is we're not seeing a lot of new ideas. Because if you were in a Black Studies department or a Gender Studies department, you wouldn't actually notice much change over the decades. But if you are in a STEM field, you would have noticed a big change in the 2010s as these ideas kind of left their home departments and sort of migrated elsewhere. So not new ideas, but the scaling up and the range of these ideas really is new. Now, I should also mention one other thing, which is if we look at public opinion data, there's what I would consider to be quite a worrying age pattern in the data. This is from British data, and it asks the question of whether J.K. Rowling should be dropped by her publisher. I've got the data spread out by age, and you can see that amongst the 18 to 25s, they are evenly split between those who want J.K. Rowling dropped by her publisher and those who don't. Whereas anyone above about age 50 is less than 5%. So we've got a massive generational difference. And actually if you unpack it even further, it's a difference within people on the left. The young leftists are much more intolerant, just much less willing to have ideas out there that are maybe challenging than older leftists. Older leftists are pretty tolerant, younger leftists are not. And you can see that also in faculty surveys. And if we look at faculty surveys, you see exactly the same pattern. Younger academics are just a lot less tolerant than old ones. And what this is leading to, by the way, and I promise this is the last two slides and I'll wrap up, is a crisis of trust in the universities. We know that just since 2015, amongst Republican voters in the US, the share that trust universities has dropped from 56% to approximately 19%. We've had a massive slide, but not even only amongst Republicans, also amongst moderates and to some extent Democrats as well. If we unpack these trends a little more, we can see that the real crisis of confidence is in the humanities and social sciences field. So if you ask the public, how much do you trust a humanities and social science professor? Among Republicans, only 34% say they trust them, 81% of Democrats. It's a big gap, but you can see how low that level of trust is. Whereas for STEM, science, tech, and engineering and math, 67% of Republicans trust a STEM professor. So there's much higher trust in the sciences than in the social sciences. In Canada, we've got some data which shows not as extreme a pattern, but if you look at social science and humanities academics, conservative voters, 49% trust in them compared to 69% trusting science academics. It's not as bad as for journalists, where trust is cratering, actually, especially amongst conservative voters. It's down around 23%. But not as bad as journalists, but if we want academia to go the way of journalism and to have the same reputation as journalism, I would argue that just keep going the way you're going. Okay, so, all right. Just to wrap up here, so I've talked about questioning some of these foundational beliefs of EDI, that equity, diversity, and inclusion should automatically be maximized. I've argued that no, they are good things in moderation, but they must be optimized, not maximized. And I think to restore trust, I mean, my view would be that it's a good idea would be to put a pause on EDI. For 10 years, perhaps for a generation. I think there's been a loss of trust because EDI has been weaponized to pursue cultural socialist ideology. And that's the reality, and I think it's the reality we have to face. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paolo.
3, 2, 1. And boom. There we go. By the way, this is actually a Dali drawing of, I don't know if my microphone is on, of my brother, who is a kind of an artist. He said, oh, let's try asking it about a horseman riding over to the city of Taranto. And then we decided to do it in the Klimt style, and I thought it was so cool I made it as my background. Mic is not on.
Actually, you can grab that.
I'll just use this mic. Okay, yeah, much better. So let me go ahead and get started here. And I want to thank everybody for listening to me. I want to thank Eric for a very engaging presentation. And there are, I think, a number of points on which we strongly agree, and look forward to having the conversation. Some on which, of course, we disagree. I think you'll find my presentation is going to be very, very different. And as you might have heard from my kind of the introduction that Jeff kindly made, I'm actually working in DI. I've been working in DI for some time. And before I dive in and talk about the content, I always like to address what I jokingly call the white elephant in the room, and that's me. It's like, why is there a white, cisgender, heterosexual male with no disabilities whatsoever talking to you about diversity, equity, and inclusion? And by the way, it's not uncommon for me to be giving talks in which I will literally be the only white person in the audience, right? So it's something that I care about a great deal. I got into this space in a very unusual way. I was born and grew up in Italy, and then I moved to the United States in my late teens. Thought, oh, I'll finish high school and then go back to Italy, and then, oh, I'll go to college and then go back to Italy. Oh, I'll have kids and go back to Italy. And now that I'm in my 60s, I actually go back to Italy all the time. But so I'm kind of an immigrant, but very privileged. And my career was very much academic. So I studied mathematics, then I studied aerospace engineering, then neuroscience. I got my PhD in computational neuroscience. I was a professor for about 10 years before I decided to give up tenure to go become an entrepreneur. And then I was an entrepreneur in kind of in the business applied world for about 15 years. And then a while back, I had this light bulb where I realized that a lot of the work that I've been doing had the potential, which a lot of it had to do with using a particular flavor of analytics, and you'll see a glimpse of that today, to understand how people behave within a particular context, societal context, whether it's a company or a marketplace or drivers on a highway. and linking that to what happens at the macroscopic level and vice versa. And I'd been interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion in parallel because I saw some things in the United States in particular that I found very troubling, and I couldn't quite make sense of them. And one day I was sitting in a session, the umpteenth session at a conference about how do we get more women into leadership roles? How do we get more black people into advertising? And I was really struck by the stark difference between the experiences that people described of what happened to them because of their gender, because of their race, because of their sexual orientation. And when it came to solutions, we had these vague ideas. We need to change the hearts and minds of the American corporations, or we need to change the way that people see things on the left and on the right and things of that sort. And as I was sitting there pondering how do you connect those two, I thought, wait a second, this is exactly what I've been doing for the last 25 years of my life, first as an academic and then as an entrepreneur. And so I dropped everything that I was doing. I started to do my own research internally. And by the way, I'd maintained ties with academia, both as an adjunct and as a researcher, and I got very excited about it. And so I dropped everything else that I was doing, and about 9 years ago, actually, in late 2015, I dove into this career. And you're going to get to see a little bit of the reason why a guy like me is sitting in a place like this telling you about that. And I want to say that when I started in DEI, if I had to go around and ask a bunch of people, how do you feel about DEI or EDI or equity, diversity, whatever you want to, it was kind of a bell curve. There were some people that hated it, some people that loved it, and most people were kind of in between. And then what happened is that George Floyd was murdered. And that was really not the tip of the iceberg, it was the straw that broke the camel's back, in the United States at least. And that led to kind of a major shift to the right, well, politically not to the right, but ideologically, let's say, toward the pro side. And then in the last few years, we've seen kind of a big backlash. And what is seen right now is this tremendous polarization, which concerns me a lot. I am not a big fan of extremism. I completely agree with Eric on that. I find that intolerance is intolerable, completely unacceptable. I hate cancel culture. I'm not going to try to push any of those things. I do not believe in extremisms of any sort. But I've been really concerned about it because ultimately what this has done is that it's translated into massive backlash that's ranged from corporate America, well, corporate really worldwide. Of course, as you all know, in the United States, affirmative action as a rule for admissions to college was struck down. And then we also see in universities, university presidents being terminated. And in the general level, like for example, one of the things that we'll talk about is the use of the word woke. It's like now become an insult, which is a little bit strange given its origin, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But so I want to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I think that the really big problem, and I'm going to be the first to admit, and if you read my book or if you read any of my writing, I often take out a big stick and beat on the head of my DEI colleagues because I realize that a lot of them are doing things that are really not right. I don't believe that they're all nearly as extremist as, unfortunately, they seem to be portrayed to be because those are the most visible ones. But even the ones that are less extreme, they make a big mistake. And I think that the biggest mistake is that even though we talk about all of these initials, and sometimes we throw in belonging and justice and access, the vast majority of the research, the vast majority of the initiatives, the vast majority of the metrics are focused only on diversity, only on representation. How many blacks, how many whites, how many Asians, how many lesbians, how many whatever. You take your favorite pick. That, I believe, is at the heart of not only the failure of the EDI or DI field to make progress, but also the reasons for the backlash. And let me explain why. So people tend to think or tend to claim that diversity is good for various aspects of an organization. This can be a commercial organization or an academic organization. I do work a lot with private companies, but I've also worked with universities, and whenever I say a term, you can take it to be equally virtually any kind of organization. And people claim, that diversity is great because it helps you to recruit from a more diverse population. It's great because it helps you to retain those people better, and so on and so forth. But sadly, what ends up happening is that the vast majority of the efforts, and certainly in academia, the majority of the effort has been on recruitment. And we need to put targets on. We need to get more black faculty. We need to get more gay faculty, more people with disabilities, and so on and so forth. And that is a really big problem. And the problem is that if you take that at face value, it leads to a very, very obvious and very correct conclusion that it's a form of reverse discrimination. So imagine you have an organization. Again, it could be a university or a company. And imagine that this organization has 1,000 employees, of whom 20% identify as white women, 5% is women of color, 5% is men of color, and the remaining 70% identify as white men. So it looks like the bar chart up there. And imagine now that the leaders of the organization, whether it's the president of the university or the CEO of a company, come out and say, we believe in this EDI, DEI, whatever you want to call it, and so we're going to set targets. And the targets are going to be 30% women, which is still well below the national average, 8% women of color, and 8% men of color. And because we know that diversity is so wonderful, we are going to assume that the company, the organization, whatever, will grow by 20% in 3 years. So you're like, oh, this is great, this is wonderful, until you squint a little bit more closely and you realize that the only way you're going to get there is by increasing the number of men of color and women of color by 46, the number of white women by 160, and reducing the number of white men by 52. This is racial and gender discrimination, period, end of story, and it is wrong. So why am I saying this to you if I believe in DI? Because I believe that this entire argument is framed on the wrong set of assumptions. And let me explain what I mean by that. This bar chart, and not coincidentally I use their colors, is data from the McKinsey Lean-In study in 2023, and it's been very similar for years. And it starts by showing the representation of those same 4 groups, which is why I use those 4 groups, at the entry level when measured across a really large number of organizations in the United States of America. I apologize, the vast majority of my data comes from the US. I think there are some similarities with other countries as well. But what's very interesting is what happens when you look as you advance through the organization. And you look at the representation of those groups as you go from the entry level to the C-suite. And what you see is that white men pick up a fairly significant 23% additional percentage points in representation, while the other groups are losing equivalent amounts. So to me, the problem is not that you need to hire more people. You have a leaky bucket. You're pouring more water into a colander. And when you do that, you're going to make a mess on the floor. And it's not going to fix anything. If you could just stop the leaks, you'd fix your problems right there. You don't have to go and recruit more people. And conversely, if you recruit more people, they're just going to be angry and upset because they're not treated well or whatever, and they're going to leave the organization. It's going to make even more of a mess. And you're going to have even more upset people because now the white men are pissed off because now you're hiring people instead of them. So that approach is completely flawed. And it really comes from the fact that we're focusing incorrectly on recruitment when we really should be focusing on retention. And I like to joke that we're focusing on the symptoms by using a simple analogy. Imagine I come home one day and I notice that it's really cold. And I look at the thermostat and it says, oh, it's only 12 degrees Celsius. So what do? I light a match under the thermostat. Oh, look, now the temperature is reading higher and higher temperatures. And meanwhile, the front door is wide open and the windows are drafty and the roof is leaking and I might burn the house down. And those people, those more extreme viewed people with whom I do not agree, that feel that the only way to solve this is by cranking up diversity and making everybody exactly equal, are making that mistake. They're fighting water with fire and it does not work. Now, I want to point something out though. This issue of the growing representation of white men in industry is not a private sector problem alone. These data are actually from the American Council of Education. And I'm going to show you for 3 dominant races. Again, I believe this is in the United States. We're going to show the representation as you go from graduate student to assistant professor, associate professor, full professor, department heads. And what you find is that in the United States of America, and I believe it's very similar now, of course, the representation of black people is not 14%, I believe, but you may have indigenous people, you can look at women, there's similar data for gender as well. And you find that the representation of white people goes a staggering delta of 81%. You go from a 56% representation to 85% representation, while black people go from 14 to 4%. And it's not just race, it's also gender, right? I'm going to use very different data, but really pretty much no matter what indicator you look at, you're going to find that there are going to be these amazing discrepancies. So if you're a woman, you're probably, by the time you get to full professor, you're making somewhere in the neighborhood on average of 17% less than a man having exactly the same role. Okay? And I'm sure that a lot of the women in the audience probably are not entirely disagreeing with that. So now I want to link it back. The topic here was supposed to be about merit. And what I want to ask you is the following. Is this a reflection of merit? Do these people increase dramatically in representation because they deserve it? Because they're somehow better? Do these women deserve to be paid less because they don't merit as much of a payment? That's the question that I would like to answer. That's what I would like to understand. Because ultimately, I don't care. It's not that I don't care about society. I think it's incredibly important to do the kind of studies that Eric does. And I have to say, by the way, I've been reading your book. I've only just started. I'm about a third of the way through. It's amazing. And I really admire people that can understand those kinds of trends. I tend to be very pragmatic, and I'm trying to understand what is going on here. Now, one of the things about merit that is particularly important to me is that, we talk about ideologies. And I have to say that meritocracy is an ideology. And it's a very flawed ideology. And let me explain why I mean that. And I hope that after this presentation, none of you will go out and gloat about wanting a meritocracy. And let me explain why. The definition of meritocracy, and this is just one of many definitions, and by the way, I'm not making this up. This is like from, I don't know, Wikipedia or some dictionary. A system in which advancement is based on individual ability or achievement. We like that. It's based on individual achievement. However, here are some of the assumptions that I think are questionable. Who defines ability? Who defines achievement? That's the first problem. And then, how do you actually define them in such a way that they can be measured? But it gets beyond that, right? Are you actually using success metrics that don't just tell you, oh, this person has 10 papers and this person has 15 papers, but when you hire that person, how are you going to tell whether the person is actually doing better or worse? What metrics do we use to tell whether our mythical meritocracy is actually working? And the reality of meritocracy is that whoever decides on the definitions and criteria is likely to inject conscious and unconscious biases. Not because they're evil, but it's very natural. I succeeded by doing this, this, and that. Therefore, I believe that anybody that does the same things that I do is likely to succeed. And if it happens that part of that success is going to an Ivy League school or belonging to a certain club or doing certain things, I'm going to assume that that's more likely to succeed than somebody that came from a very different background. Also, the use of very clear and consistent criteria is really uncommon. I find that when people talk about meritocracy, a lot of times if you go and ask them exactly what are the criteria, it's very hard to find. And the metrics to actually track the progress is even less common. And I'll tell you what never happens. I have never seen an organization that set out a set of criteria for what actually makes a meritorious candidate and then tracked it over 10 or 15 years to tell whether their criteria were actually right or not. So if you're not doing this, I am sorry, but meritocracy is a myth. It's an ideology. So don't tell me that we only hire the best. Don't talk to me about lowering the bars unless you show me where the bar is and how you're computing it. There's a phenomenal book by Emily Chang called Brotopia that I highly recommend to people, in which she basically points out that giving the illusion of fairness, in reality, meritocracy is a rich getting richer dynamic. It builds and amplifies existing biases. It reduces the representation of talented people from underappreciated groups because it tends to drive homogeneity. And so really meritocracy is a self-fulfilling and self-sustaining system that exacerbates systemic disparities and increases homogeneity. Which means that if you go back to the title of the presentation, how does DI relate to merit? There is a very strong negative correlation. The more you believe in a meritocracy, the more homogeneous the organization is going to become. Now, again, this is not about ideology. I'm kind of making a statement that I think is relatively easy to prove. So I'm going to argue, however, and this is where I take out my stick and I go back to beating up on the people that are on the DI side of the audience, which is that we make this mistake all the time, that we equate, and when I say we, I really mean people in my space, in the DI space. We only think of the D. We only think of diversity, but diversity is not the same thing as DEI. So I'm going to give you my definitions, and I'm only going to have a chance to talk to the first two of them, but I believe that there is a much simpler way to think about it, which is that inclusion as an organization is about what you do to your people. Diversity is what you get. It's the outcome. I'm not going to talk about why I say that equity is what you want, but I have some papers that show that there is a very direct economic impact that comes from not being inclusive toward people. And by the way, my definition of inclusion is very different from the one that Eric suggested. I don't believe that has to do with creating safe spaces and things of that sort. Although you will see that there is something interestingly similar in that. Let me explain what I mean by inclusion. Imagine you have a team, and this team is the perfect team. It could be in a class, it could be a bunch of faculty members writing grant proposals, it could be in an organization, like a company. And this team is perfect, by which I mean each individual is performing at their peak, and as a team, they work perfectly together. You cannot get any kind of additional performance than you can get out of this team. And imagine now that something happens to one person that reduces their ability to perform at their peak. Whatever happens to the performance of the whole team, of course, it's going to decline. Suppose that now something happens to a second person that also reduces their ability to perform. Of course, the performance of the team will decline further, but now you're going to start to see ripple effects because the rest of the team has to pick up the slack. They're going to be late on writing the grant proposal or finishing that homework assignment, and then pretty soon they're going to get a bad grade or they're not going to get a proposal, and the Office of Sponsored Programs will not support them the next time and give them the 10% overhead rate and things of that sort. And pretty soon the entire performance of the team will decline rather precipitously. Now, I haven't said anything about the gender, the race, the sexual orientation, or any other aspect of these people, but it leads to a very profound conclusion. Anything that an organization does that causes any of its people to be less able to perform their work because of their personal identity traits will impact the entire organization negatively. And I want you to think about this. The positive side of this is that any organization that identifies obstacles that are causing some people to perform less than others will likely increase the performance of the whole organization. This is assuming equal talent, right? I'm talking about things that have nothing to do with their talent. And if you think about it, it makes sense because what's the organization? It's not like, the doors outside, oh, look, there are black people coming, shut the doors. No, the organization is nothing but the collection of the people that make it up. And what we all do, this is why I say inclusion is about what an organization does, impacts the performance of all the people, which impacts the performance of the organization. And I'm going to show you, just very briefly, the geeky side of me, or the academic side of me. I'm going to show you these computer simulations. There's a whole field, complexity science, which is kind of part of my background. And we build these computer simulations that are like Sims games. You literally simulate the behaviors of individuals so that you preserve what's happening at the individual level, and then you let the simulation capture the interactions, capture the causal dynamics, so that you can see the macroscopic effects. So here is a very simple organization with 4 levels. We could call them postdocs, and assistant professor, associate professor, full professor. You could call them entry level, manager, VPs, executives, whatever you want to. Half of them are men, half of them are women. I'm not suggesting that gender is binary, although some people like to feel comfortable with that. I don't really care either way. It could be people with disabilities, without disabilities. It could be Italians and Canadians. I don't really care, okay? But let's, for simplicity, assume that it's men and women. So here's what happens when I run the simulation. So it's literally simulating day-by-day operations of a company. Some people are getting promoted. Some people turn gray and disappear. They're the ones that are either quitting or getting terminated. The point is that when I run the simulation under very simple assumptions, you find that the company always stays balanced, 50-50 all the way up and down. So then I ask myself, what happens if there is a bias in the way that promotions take place? What happens if whenever there is an opportunity for a promotion, the men get a slight leg up on the competition? Not that it ever happens in real companies or organizations, right? But what would the simulation do? So I'm going to simulate a form of exclusion, where I'm being less inclusive toward women than toward men. I run the simulation again. I do exactly the same thing, 5 years, start 50-50. And what you find, this is going a little bit faster, you find that lo and behold, after 5 years, this is what it looks like. 80% men at the top, 70% men at the next level, and so on and so forth, which should look suspiciously familiar to some of the data that I showed you before. And in fact, this is not just a suspicion. With my colleague Qibin Zhang, we published a paper in an academic journal, peer-reviewed, in which we showed that using this very simple simulation, we could actually capture very accurately, by just changing 2 parameters, the kinds of disparities that you see across, we actually did it across 6 different industries. So this is why I say that inclusion is what you do and diversity is what you get. And this is fairly good science and research that I've done that kind of proves that. And the last 5 minutes of the presentation, I want to talk about a very important point. Why do people not measure inclusion? Why do we only focus on diversity? And I think that there are 2 reasons. One of them is because while diversity is relatively easy to define, inclusion is not. I heard a brand new definition of inclusion today. I'd never heard your particular definition, but I can tell you that if you go online and you look for 10 different definitions, or you ask 10 people for definitions of inclusion or equity, you will get 10 different answers, probably even 100. And that's one problem. And most of them are very qualitative. Diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. Very, very nice, intuitive, but unless you're running a party company, completely useless. So that's one problem. But the second problem is that it turns out that inclusion itself is invisible. And I purposefully made the word invisible so that it's almost invisible. And let me explain what I mean by that. Another simple analogy is between inclusion and health. When I introduced myself, or when Jeff introduced me, he didn't say, this is Paolo and he's very healthy today. But if I'd had COVID, or if I'd been coughing, I might have said something about it. The bottom line is, we tend to notice when we're not healthy, when we're sick, rather than when we're healthy. Inclusion is the same way. We tend to notice inclusion when we don't have it. We're more likely to notice exclusion. Now, here's a very, very profound realization that we came to. If you're very healthy, you might hear about the name of a disease. You may not know what the hell it means. You will certainly not know what the symptoms are. And even if somebody describes the symptoms, you would not know what it is, and you would certainly not know how to cure it. Similarly, with inclusion. If you have never been excluded, you do have no idea what exclusion means. You do not know what the symptoms are. Even if you hear them, you do not know what they really mean. And you sure as heck do not know how to fix the problem if you hear about it. But the problem is that whereas in a room like this, most of us have had some form of disease or another, in most organizations, the people that are the most included are the leaders, are the ones that make the decisions for everyone. And they are the least aware of what it means, and they're the ones that are least qualified to do anything about it. So what do? They hire somebody and say, you're going to be the chief diversity officer because you're different from me, because you're black, because you're gay, because you have a disability. And here, I'm going to dump it on you, and you're going to put some targets, and we're going to try to fix this together. And that's just not a really good idea. What you really need is the collaboration. You really need to think about this more carefully. So what we decided to do is realize that when you ask about health, you don't just ask people how healthy are you on a scale of 1 to 10. You ask about symptoms. Why? Well, because once you understand that there is a certain cluster of symptoms, you can identify the disease and try to fix it. And so we did exactly the same thing and came up with this idea of what we call the experience categories. And these are the clusters of kinds of things that happen to you in the workplace. It's things like work-life balance, access and participation, information sharing, career and growth. So what we do is we do activities where we do a presentation, we talk about these ideas in more detail than I'm doing today, and then we ask people using an online platform that is completely anonymous, untraceable, and confidential, we ask them to provide some basic information about their identity, as well as the roles in the job. And then we ask them to just tell us stories of things that have happened to you in the workplace. Very specific. Don't tell me about like, oh, I feel like I'm being treated unfairly. Tell us exactly what happened. And then tell us 2 things. What is the category? And also, what is the source of the experience? And in an academic environment, the sources might be either some workplace policies, or it could be the leadership at the university level, at the school level, at the department level. It could be your peers and colleagues. It could be your students. It could be people outside the organization. And with those 2 bits of data plus the qualitative data, we get some incredible insights, because the quantitative data tells us where to look in terms of the categories, the sources, and the identity traits that matter. And the qualitative, so that tells us where the biggest opportunities to remove some of those obstacles might be. And the qualitative data tells us exactly what is happening so that we can try and fix it. And I'm going to give you very quickly some data, and again, very different. We're now talking about like data from organizations. This is hot off the press. We did a project with an organization called Women in Cybersecurity, and we worked with about 1,000 people in which we asked them to participate with the platform. And the data that I'm going to show you, this particular one is about gender. So we calculate what we call the exclusion score, and I'm happy to go into details, anybody wants to know that. When we calculate the exclusion score, which is a reflection of completely voluntarily telling information, and by the way, these days, a lot of men complain about being excluded because of DEI, but we still find that the exclusion score for women overall is 2.1 times in the cybersecurity field, and it's a pretty bad field at that, than it is for men. And when we break it down by those categories, we see even more stark contrast. We see, for example, that respect is 2.5 times higher for women than it is for men. I think that for most women in this audience, that will not be surprising, because this stuff happens in academia as well. Recognition, 4.5 times. And when we look at other identity traits and we compare, for example, the data from everybody who identified as a man versus everybody who identified as a woman, or everybody who identified as white versus other races, we see a very systematic shift across every single identity dimension. So the last thing I'm going to leave you with is just to give you some reality of what these data mean. I'm going to tell you some of the experiences that people shared. When people do this, we always tell them that by default, we will never share any experience unless they positively put a check mark on each and every single experience that they feel that it's okay to share in a situation like this. So for example, these are all academic, by the way. In faculty meeting, some of the other professors often talk over me and shut down what I have to say. When I go to meetings with new individuals at the university, I'm commonly asked pedigree questions. Where are you from? Where did you get your degree? Et cetera, et cetera. And these kind of things happen very systematically to certain groups of people. Or as an assistant professor, a comment was made to me, you will get tenure because you're female. These are just some of the thousands of examples, some of which are also significantly worse than that. Recognition. Colleagues forget to cite my papers that inspire their work. Or I feel like I have to work twice as hard to get half the recognition, and it's not cliche. I cannot get away with bad reviews or bad student evaluations, which puts a lot of mental and emotional pressure on me and impacts my personal time. Or when a colleague was asked to lead the development of my nomination for fellow, he only wanted to provide evidence of impact related to diversity efforts, although I felt I had technicas areas of impact, which were not recognized. Work-life balance. I had 2 children pre-tenure and had to delay my tenure decision, putting me behind in the promotion process compared to my cohort. Or I delayed my family planning due to the perceptions and comments from colleagues, and so on and so forth. You know, it's always commented on how many children I have. So I want to wrap up by asking the people in the audience, especially those who may not have all the privilege that I do, to imagine walking into a meeting in that hypothetical company that set the new goals and ask you, which would you prefer? Would you prefer to see that the targets that were set out by the administration were met, but you're still treated like crap? Or would you prefer to see that when you walk into a meeting, whether it's in a university or a company, your ideas are heard and you have the same chances as everybody else to get ahead, and that your work will be recognized and that you're treated fairly? If you want what's on the left, you want diversity. And I think it's a big mistake that too many people are focusing on that because it's the only thing they've been able to measure. If, on the other hand, you're willing to look at inclusion, which I think is what most people care about, you need to figure out a way to measure it, and I've just shown you one way of doing that. And one of the things that we realize is that when you compare these two, and I'm just going to put all of these up right now, there are several benefits to measuring inclusion instead of measuring diversity. And I think it avoids a lot of the kind of backlash that results from this idea that it's a zero-sum game. Your gain is my loss. And one of the things that I like to use this little analogy, you might have heard the expression that a rising tide lifts all boats equally. With inclusion, in a way, it's even better, because if you think of exclusion as resulting from structural barriers that create uneven levels of well-being for different groups, when you rain down inclusion, you're benefiting the organization, but you're really benefiting the most of those people that need it the most, but you're also benefiting everybody else. And by the way, one of those comments about family leave was actually a man that wrote it. So, as was already said, my only product placement is that I do have a book coming out in September. I hope this is of interest, and now I look forward to having a fun conversation with Eric. Thank you.
First of all, I never seem to get a QR code to work. I don't know what the magic is, but yeah, I really, first of all, I really appreciate Paolo coming here, and it's very important to get that relatively positive on DEI position, because often these are siloed. But yeah, so what would I start with? I mean, there are places of agreement, so when you talk about measures which are facially neutral. So if we talk about the number of days you have to come into work, maternity or paternity leave, blind CVs or other kinds of metrics or tools that can get rid of certain kinds of biases through a process. Yeah, I think that's an excellent way forward. So I would agree with you there. I mean, so let's just say that if we can find unobtrusive ways to broaden a pipeline and get rid of, screen out particular biases that could occur, whether socially or through perceptions or whatever, I think those are all to the good. So let me agree with you there. Where would I sort of disagree? I mean, I guess what I want to see grappling with are some of these thorny, hard questions. So let us say somebody says that, that speaker makes me feel unsafe. They're affecting my learning experience, and therefore you can't let them onto the campus because that's going to affect whether I'm included. I'm just taking a hypothetical argument. What would you respond to somebody who came to you with that argument?
Yeah, so I would smile, get another drink, and say, ask Eric. No, I'm just kidding. No, and actually, so before I answer your question, I want to say, first of all, I do think there's a lot of grounds for agreement. And by the way, I have to say, and I'm not trying to flatter you here, but I was reading, White Shift, and as I said, I haven't gotten very far, but very impressive. And I think that some of the arguments that you make are really, really powerful. And it seems like you too are, at least at the time that you wrote the book, you felt that polarization was not necessarily a good thing. I'm somewhat aware of some of the issues that you've had to face. I believe, just on the record, cancel culture sucks. It should not. It should be canceled. It's hypocritical to say that. But so I firmly disagree with anyone who takes a very extreme view on either side of the fence with that. Okay. Now, as to your specific question, the one thing that I tend to, as I was trying to make clear, first of all, I tend to focus on retention more than recruitment. I think that just trying to stuff more people from diverse background into an environment that is probably not very welcoming for them is counterproductive. And if you think about the pyramid that I showed, whether it was the academic one or the corporate one, if you could just simply stop the leakage, and I'm not looking for perfection, but if you're starting with 23% men and white men and you end up with 57% white men or whatever the numbers were on the chart, then I would say, look, if you improve by half, if you can stop leaking, and by the way, in every organization, and I'm sure that in every university, if you look not just at representation, but look at how quickly people go through tenure. Look at how many papers out of the ones that they submit, how many of them are actually accepted. Look at how many of the grants they write, how many are accepted. You're going to see some very, very systematic differences that are very difficult to explain, even if you account for all kinds of different variables. So I would say in terms of the retention, in terms of the recruitment, I tend to agree with you that simply try to do blind resumes. I think that there are definitely biases that exist in the way that people perceive candidates of a particular sort, and those can be fixed. But I think a more important point is to fix what happens on the inside. Now, as far as the hot potato question that you threw my way, all I can say is that I study complexity science, and one of the things that I'm very skeptical of is anybody that tries to give a very simple answer to a very complex problem. And I think that this is true on all sides of it. I believe these are incredibly challenging problems. I believe that it's very easy to couch them as black and white questions. And oftentimes, those are, in my opinion, they're kind of false dichotomies. And so if you get caught in the, well, is this right or is this right, very often you end up with basically a very divisive conversation where it boils down to opinion. I believe that trans rights are universal and should be sacred, or I believe that, you know, being able to be a woman and not feel like I have to compete with a woman that used to be a man, I believe that that's sacred. You're never going to get people to agree on that, right? So what I try to advise people when asked questions like that is to say, can we think of a different way to approach that issue? Can we think of what it is that you actually care about, that you feel is being violated by those questions, and can we talk about that? And can we find some common ground where it doesn't boil down to ideology, where it doesn't boil down to individual beliefs and opinions, but where we might actually say, you know, if we get to the point where like we agree to disagree, but we do it respectfully, I think that's wonderful. And to me, that's one of the things I have to say that I really like about Heterodox. There have been some people on Heterodox that I find are writing some comments that make me a little bit upset because I feel that they represent an aspect of DEI that is not really what it's about. But I do, you know, I do think that it's wonderful to see these kinds of conversations. So that would be my long answer to your very simple question.
Yeah, and I think what's fun about the Heterodox method is we can kind of draw out, you know, there may be some priority and value differences, you know, in terms of valuing, let's say, freedom versus equal outcomes. And that's fine. People have different values. I guess I do think there's more of a conflict, say, between these competing values, and people can land on different sides of what they value. But I do think there is a tension between, you know, for example, inclusion or equity and, say, freedom and even merit. I guess I would defend merit more than you would, and I think. You know, and it also strikes me, I suppose, that there are certain categories of interest. So, for example, if you broke out women into women with children and women without children, you might get a very different graph, right? But that doesn't seem to be something that is necessarily done as much as it maybe should be. So maybe the problem is women with children, and so then maybe we should be thinking about maternity leave being longer or other kinds of unobtrusive measures. But it just seems like there is always a rush to, and as you pointed out really in your talk, you know, a rush to those top line numbers. The other thing, well, let's stick with that. I don't want to complicate things, but I just wonder if there is a certain sacredness around certain categories that has developed, and that can get in our way, because maybe we really need to focus on the women with children, and maybe that's the issue.
So 2 ways that I would answer your question. Are there certain categories that have become sacred in certain circles by certain people? Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that I'm not a big fan of sacred cows. I don't believe that, I'm not a traditionalist. I'm not particularly conservative. I believe that upholding anything as an absolute is a mistake because it tends to create polarization, so I don't believe in that. I do think that in my approach to the work, which may be evident when you think back on it, I've always been very grounded. Like when I was doing my PhD, I was studying the visual system. A lot of my colleagues were studying the visual system. I ended up studying the retina. Why? Because I was like, all my friends that were studying, you know, visual recognition, facial recognition, invariant, you know, this and that and the other. And I was like, how the hell do we go from a sunlit ice field in the daytime to a dimly lit theater and be able to see over something like 9 orders of magnitude of illumination when the first neurons in our eye can only see 2 orders of magnitude of signal to noise ratio? How the hell do you do that, right? So with this work, I'm kind of the same way. It's like, you know, we want to agree or disagree about trans, about this, about that. We have different opinions. I happen to have, by the way, 2 trans stepdaughters, which is a very interesting experience to go through as a cisgender white man, and I'd be more than happy to talk about it with people. And I can tell you it's not a particularly pretty thing for people to do, right? But leaving that aside, I focus on like, okay, look, if there is a problem in an organization and I can measure the problem, it's not about, oh, is it a problem about women with children or without women with children? If I see that a lot of people complain about poor policies for family leave policies, and it turns out that of the 100 people that complain, 3 of them are men, 83 are women with children, and the others, whatever, 14, my math escapes me right now, are women without children. Great. You know, to me, in a way, that's less relevant than say, okay, well, then there is a problem. Can we come up with a policy that makes it better? So in a way, I'm lazy in the sense that I try to sidestep some of those issues because I kind of feel that you can which is why I was never a philosopher, but more of an engineer. It's like, I want to solve the damn problem. I don't want to sit here and argue about what's the right solution or not. So again, I completely understand where you're coming from. I think that some of these discussions are very engaging. They're very interesting. I can get very passionate about it. But when it comes to my work, I try to just focus on what can I get done? What can I measure? And how can I make things better for people? And not because I think that these people are sacred. Just that if I can make it better for some people, then I'm going to feel better at the end of the day. I'm going to feel like, okay, I did something that is good for society, that somehow is going to make everybody go to work and feel a little bit more happy, and it's going to make the company work better. It's going to make the university work better. So.
Yeah, and yeah, who could argue with that? I mean, I guess I guess if we move over to different areas, I mean, there's one question perhaps on some of the metrics. So if we talk about subjective beliefs, right, about feeling disrespected, being discriminated against. To what extent do we simply accept that as the truth, or can that be to some degree processed differently by different people? And I'll just give you an example just from some data. I mean, there's a lot of data on this, but for example, if you ask African Americans, how often do you experience racism? You get about 30%. If you say, how often do you experience racism? How often do you experience racism under Donald Trump's period of the presidency, 2016 to 20? And then you ask them, how often do you experience racism under Barack Obama's period in the presidency from 2008? The difference amongst black Democrats is 20 points. There's like a 100% difference, even though it's very unlikely the amount of racism they personally experienced. And the question was about personal experience, differed so greatly between these two presidents. Now, what I'm saying here, and similarly, there are studies that look at social media exposure and can show quite a lot of difference in terms of personal. How often did people act like they didn't respect you, that you weren't smart, et cetera? And it varies quite a bit between those who are heavily on social media and those who are not. So what I'm saying is, I don't think we can simply accept subjective testimony as automatically correct in measuring something real because of motivated reasoning, because of other things that the mind does, the tricks that the mind can play on us. So I'm just wondering whether there isn't also another story here, which is that we also have to build up perhaps the confidence. We have to get over the imposter syndrome, and maybe that, increasing the strength perhaps of certain kinds of minorities, that maybe they're seeing a situation in a way that isn't actually accurate, there could be some benefit to that. And that would be maybe a better way to go than to try and sort of accuse majority or dominant groups as somehow discriminating when the evidence, the sort of hard scientific evidence, is not really that strong.
Wow, that was a loaded question there. And I do have a question for you at the end, but I am... So first of all, a clarification. The very first time that we did one of these measuring inclusion assessments, as we call them, we had the category respect. And what we found was that a lot of people, and we used to talk to them about as categories of exclusion. And that was a mistake, because we found that a lot of the men in the audience would say, I've never felt excluded before. And then sometimes people would basically attach respect with virtually every answer that they gave. And so we realized it's like, kind of like what you're saying, we don't want to know about opinions about how you feel, because your feeling is ultimately an outcome of the things that happen to you. We want to know what actually happened. We want to know the facts, just the facts, man, right? So what we did is that we changed it so that now we're very careful that we tell people these are workplace experiences. We want to know workplace experiences that have interfered with your ability to perform at your peak. And then we also ask them to be as specific as possible. And when we look at the answers, if anybody writes things like, oh, I'm very mad because people discriminate against me, we tend to ignore those. And by the way, we get a lot of those from white men these days, a lot of them. So one of the things I would say is that I'm going to, and I don't want this to turn into a tit for tat, but I know that for every bit of science that you can cite that argues that perceptions are wrong in one direction, I can probably cite one that goes in the opposite direction. The fact is, we're humans, we make fallacies. In my work, the way that I try to get around that is to acknowledge that two things. One of them is that we all have flawed perceptions, all of us. But I also acknowledge one other thing, and this, by the way, worked really well in my first marriage. Even though I'm no longer in my first marriage, I'm wonderful friends with my first wife. And one of the things I learned the hard way is that if I made her feel upset it didn't really matter whether I meant to or not. I would just apologize. And I wish that I'd learned that a little bit earlier, right? And this is maybe a bit of an extreme case, but it's like, I think that sometimes we forget that if people, I'm not going to go into that, but there's examples of situations where you put people in a certain condition and they behave in a way that makes them feel like they would be discriminated against when they really clearly were not. But in a lot of cases, it's like, the burnt cat is afraid of the cold water, right? I mean, it's like, if you go through a lot of things fairly regularly, then it's entirely reasonable that sometimes things that would not upset you or me might upset somebody else, whether it's a black person, a person with a disability, or a woman. And so we just have to be, I try to be understanding, and I try to make sure that in my work, is it 100% accurate? I'm not sure, but you know what? When I see a factor of 2.1x, this is not a difference of 5% with a probability of less than 0.01 using a t-tailed, whatever. This is like 2.1 factor, 4.5 factor. That cannot be attributed to any kind of, sort of like sample biases or anything like that. So.
Yeah, I mean, okay, and I suppose, yeah, as you say, I mean, there's going to be a disagreement, and this is a good disagreement. I think that there's a strong case to be made that, in fact, perceptions are extremely important. So, for example, if you take young women now and they're asked, the share of women at university, for example, has been rising, and if you ask young women whether they think women are discriminated against in university entrance, the percentage has been rising substantially through the mid-2010s to now. And it's very difficult to see anything in the data that could possibly justify that rise in perception. Similarly, by the way, there was a big jump in perception that there's white supremacy and there's racism in America from the mid-2010s. From about 2013, there was almost essentially more than a doubling from 35 to 80% of white liberal Americans saying that racism is a very big problem in America. And again, you look at either marriage data, you look at police shooting data, very difficult to see anything hard and concrete that could justify that shift in perceptions. And so I wouldn't underestimate the role of the media, the role of social media in being able to inflate perceptions. And that's the only caveat that I would make there is not to underestimate that.
So again, I would say two things. I mean, the first one is a lot of it is awareness, not perception, and I want to be a little bit careful about that. You seem to make an implicit assumption that those shifts in perception are in some way one-sided. I think they happen in both directions. And I just want to leave you, and then I do want to ask you one question. I want to leave you with one point. You're challenging sort of like the based on some macroscopic data about factors that you've seen over time. But what I want to understand is this. It's possible that it's just the perception problem, but then how do you explain that 81% of department heads in the United States are men, when at the entry level, at the graduate student level, it's only 51%, or whatever number it was? How do you explain that?
Right, so it depends on the data, whether it's longitudinal, right? So clearly, if it is snapshot data, one could say that it's an age effect, perhaps, rather than a cohort effect. So there's age and cohort effects, right? Are we saying that, if you had data that went back 30 years and we could do an age period cohort analysis and screen out what is to do with the life course, what is to do with generation, and so on, then I think it would strengthen it. I mean, I think if we just look at the sort of cross-sectional profile by age, we don't know what's going to happen in the future, right? I mean, it could be that the picture will change over time. I mean, if you looked at, for example, in 1960, you would see, that there would be a lot of Italians and Irish at the lower ranks, and it would be only WASPs, like madmen, in the C-suite. But by the time we hit, 1980, that's really changing quickly. So I just think without a longitudinal study, it's very hard. The other thing, of course, is, I mean, you're probably aware that there are people who argue that, just in terms of the bell curve distribution towards the tales that with men are more extreme. There's more of them that are, begging in the street and in jail and at the bottom end, but there's more of them in the top end as well. And this has to do with, essentially evolutionary psychology. It has to do with, the way IQ is distributed, not the mean IQ, but the distribution, the number of people who are willing to work 80 hours a week, give up their entire life, essentially be slaves to their job is just much higher. It's dysfunctional. Women have got it much much better in terms of a work-life balance, but the number of men who are willing to sort of sacrifice their lives to work all hours to get there. Now the question, I suppose, that's sort of how the alternative would be to say, well, that is why you're getting men at 80% in the C-suite. And now the other question we might ask is, why is the average CEO 6'2"? But that's another question.
All right, so I think maybe we'll wrap up this conversation part, and then we'll open it up for questions. And Will McNally is going to monitor the Slido. So what we'll do is we'll give one of the microphones to him, and then you guys can pass back and forth. Sound good?
All right.
All right.
Okay.
Who wants to have it? All right.
Love sharing.
All right.
Okay, there's been a ton of response on Slido that I'm not going to share with you. I'm just going to read the questions. And then there's been some voting, so I'm just going to go through the top voted questions. And the first one's a real curveball. How would you define whiteness as it's mentioned in Laurier's Strategic Equity, Diversity, Inclusivity Plan under the pillar of decentering whiteness? Start with the easy one.
So would you mind if I take a stab at this?
You go.
Okay. So one of the things that I am not an expert on race relations, critical race theory. I probably have read more than a lot of you here, but I would never consider, and plus look at this face, right? So I wouldn't know that. But one thing that I have noticed that is very true, and there's a lot of data, is, in fact, Eric, I think that I read something that you said, which is that being white in a way becomes a default. And you almost like don't notice it. And a lot of times where we can run into problems like, white fragility or white reactions is when people are suddenly confronted with the fact that there are certain things about them that maybe diverge because of their ethnicity from other kinds of social constructs. And so I think that the point of what I understand in my very limited understanding of the idea of decentering whiteness is the idea that whiteness is often taken like the air around you. You don't notice it until you're missing it. Or like being a fish in water, you don't notice that there is water all around you until you miss that. And I think that there's a degree to which when we talk about race, if I say, like, think about a person of race, you're going to, like, even when you say a diverse person, like, to me, the idea that the adjective diverse immediately implies somebody who's either black or brown or has some difference is just because we're so accustomed to looking around us and seeing a sea of faces that, although I have to say Toronto is very diverse that way, right? But anyway, so I think that's what that usually means, is the idea of let's get away from assuming that everything that is white is kind of the default and that's kind of like the right way to do it, and that everything from that is a deviation. That's an assumption. I've not actually read that particular EDI statement, and it's my best attempt at explaining what I think some people in the field mean by that. Did you want to?
Yeah, sure. I guess this is a bit closer to some of the things that I've studied. So it's worth saying that the origin of this whiteness term comes from probably Noel Ignatieff, but this idea that race is a construction, and that white is a construction, and that basically some of the arguments are that the white race and the boundaries of the white race have been constructed over time in order to yield benefits, material benefits and psychological benefits for particular elites. So, for example, the idea that white Protestant Americans decided to include Catholics and Jews just to bolster their coalition against African Americans, for example, is one argument. And Richard Alba, in his book, he's got a recent book. I'm trying to remember if it's called The Diversity Delusion, but essentially he sort of unpacks this, because the problem with this whiteness claim is it is very often unfalsifiable. So how might I disprove the claim that whiteness is some kind of racial conspiracy designed to yield economic and psychological benefits for particular individuals, such as business owners? And it's very scarce, to find hard quantitative metrics. But what Alba does is he says, well, let's look at the case for whiteness, and why is it the case? How can we explain white Protestants opening up the labor market to white Catholics and Jews post 1945? So the minority population wasn't growing. This was pre-civil rights. Where was this great threat that led the WASPs to say, we're not going to stop. We're going to stop discriminating against Catholics. We're going to allow John F. Kennedy to be the first Catholic president, and we're going to allow some CEOs who aren't WASP. It doesn't make any sense actually. So a lot of the argument, and similarly, I think you could argue today that it doesn't really make any sense when actually we're seeing a fair bit of minority upward mobility, particularly in the, again, yes, it's true, it's more in the lower ranks, but we haven't had enough time yet. You know, again, Catholics and Jews were completely underrepresented in 1945. By 1980, they were pretty much even with WASPs. So I think this is part of critical race theory, which sort of has this concept of structural racism. The problem with structural racism as a theory is if you're going to say that some sort of thing called structural racism is the reason we see race disparities, you've got to be able to independently measure this structure and the disparity. You can't define the structural racism as the disparity. Otherwise, it's a circular argument. So I would say simply tell me how I measure and can falsify and test this thing called a structure in order to see that maybe your argument for racial diversity or disparity, how could I maybe disprove your argument that something called structural racism is causing racial disparity as opposed to some other factor which is causing racial disparity? That's a bit of a mouthful, I'm sorry.
At this pace, we'll be here a while.
Yeah, I know.
Well, the next, there's one here that's just too hot for us to discuss. So I'm going to tell you what it was, but I'm not going to invite you to speak to it because it could lead to the room emptying. But I think I know who asked it. Are pineapples a valid pizza topping, was the question.
Can I give you one quick answer?
If
There was a meme on the internet of somebody saying, here's why ChatGPT was banned in Italy, and it's because it answered that, yes, it's okay to put pineapple on pizza. So,
I'm surprised it didn't scold the person for asking the question in the first place. So the next serious question is, how do you preserve human dignity while carving people up into categories according to physical characteristics?
go ahead. I have an answer about it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't, I'm not one of these people who say, like Coleman Hughes says, it's one thing, he does see race. There are racial differences that are out there. It's just that they shouldn't play a role for hiring for a job. It shouldn't, the role that race plays should be different. We should approach things in a colorblind way. It doesn't mean we don't see color. And it also, by the way, doesn't mean that people can't identify as black. And Jonathan Haidt's point is, it's not a black identity or Chinese identity or even white identity. These are not problematic things if they are moderate, right? And if there is what Jonathan Haidt calls a common humanity version of these identities, that they are based in this idea, we're not going to just try and do everything for my group and to hell with other groups, and also we're not just going to define being black as resistance to white Americans or to whites. You have to look at the totality of the black experience, where they were inventive, where they were creative, where they were successful, and there are many examples of that. That has to be part of the black identity too, not just being a victim. And so I think it's okay to have these identities, whether ethnic, pan-ethnic, whatever. I don't think the problem is the identity. I think just the problem is the weaponization of identity and the use of identity in hiring instead of being colorblind in hiring.
Yeah, my answer was going to be in a slightly different direction, which is that, first of all, I do not at all want to claim that I can, speak for people who do not look like me, because I don't want to do that. But what I can tell you is, in the data that I see, something very interesting, in the complaints about DEI that have become very, very frequent in the last year or so, we get a lot of complaints from white men, primarily white men, sometimes white women, but mostly white women, who complain about, being replaced and not being hired and things like that, or not being promoted. We also get a lot of complaints from people, who are brown, black, etc., who complain about a couple things. One of them is the fact that they become tokenized and they feel like they're the diversity hire. And I think you saw a comment about the woman that said, I was told that the only way that I would make tenure is because I'm a female. Okay, and that happens, unfortunately, a lot, where all of a sudden, because there is EDI mandates, it's assumed that if you're black, you're only there because you're black, right? And in fact, Azim Sharif, with whom I had a similar conversation a month ago, made a very similar comment about he being of Indian origin, actually having that kind of situation. And the other thing that happens is that the stress, and you saw from my slide, I don't believe that measuring diversity is really a very good idea. I think that focusing too much on buckets just makes people feel very bad. And one of the things that I see is people that say, look, I'm an Indian woman, and all of a sudden, because there's some kind of Indian festival, they come to me and they ask me to put together something to talk about the experience of Indian women. It's like, I'm just one, I'm not like all of them. And so there is a very, very heavy sense of responsibility that's placed on people because of being burdened with, oh, you're exactly this identity. So I tend to agree that focusing, and that's one of the reasons why I focus on inclusion, focusing too much on identity is a very, very slippery slope. Because on the one hand, it's great to acknowledge people's identities. It's great to acknowledge that some of those identity traits may have had an impact on experiences, but it can easily become obsessive and it can be damaging, I think, too. From what I hear, what I'm relating is that it's damaging on both sides.
All right. Excellent. The next highest rated question, does a drop in religious belief amongst faculty correlate to EDI policies being introduced?
That's yours.
My answer is no, actually. I don't think that the woke phenomenon has a whole lot to do, or the EDI phenomenon, with the decline of religion. Now, why would I say that? I mean, I've done some research on this, and we've had some conversations around this. But, for example, now, religion matters insofar as people who are religious are more likely to be conservative or Republican, and therefore they will be opposed to DEI. But if we just take somebody who is a Democrat and a liberal, but is deeply religious, and a Democrat and a liberal who is an atheist, there is no difference in the degree to which politics is meaningful for them. There's no difference in their views on white guilt, on a whole bunch of questions. So my view is actually religion on its own is really not the bulwark against, and I know there's a lot of people who've written about this. The book American Awakening by Mitchell, for example, is a great book. That's one example. Even Douglas Murray, a lot of them will talk about this, because of the loss of religion. Woke is a replacement religion, and I'm not as convinced by that, actually. There have been a lot of replacement religions since the Enlightenment, so I don't credit that as being particularly important, no.
Paolo, you want to touch it?
I honestly don't know anything, no.
Well, this one is for Paolo only. Are you making a faulty assumption that women want to be in the C-suite?
So there's, just like as I was telling Eric, there are studies that show one thing, there are studies that show another thing. So there was a series of studies that came out some time ago saying that women seem to be less ambitious and less likely to want to do that. But then there were other studies that say, well, yeah, but if you look at it, it's because basically they've had experiences that have made them feel that there is no way they would be able to get there and that they would be strongly discouraged. Now, it turns out my impression is that I don't personally believe that in general, if you look at the data from graduate school participation, there was a recent study that actually looked at MBA students. And they found that as you go through primary school, secondary school, and up to a certain level, the level of interest in achieving certain levels of success in men and women is virtually identical. And in fact, with girls at a younger age, when I'm talking like elementary school, there's actually evidence that, and having had both a girl and a boy myself, I can tell you that there is definitely significantly more maturity, significantly more ambition early on in life. And there's a lot of evidence that a lot of the ambition is kind of pounded out of you over time because of culture, because of the things that you see every day, because of whether it's images from the media, social or traditional media, whether it's experiences that you have in the workplace. So my candid impression is that in general, I would say it's absolutely not the case that there are statistically significant differences in the ambition of women to achieve positions of power and influence. I think that some of those, if you test them in a certain way, you may see statistical differences, but in a lot of cases, it's because you're not necessarily asking the right questions or you're not trying to understand the reasons for those differences underneath. So that's but again, this is a very hotly debated topic. And you look like you have something that you wanted to add to that.
Well, I just think it would be interesting to be able, how could we devise a study? So if I were to say, how could I falsify your hypothesis? Perhaps the question is, how could I test these competing hypotheses? One, that there's the evolutionary psychology and different ambition, willingness to work crazy hours, versus yours, that it's about experiences, and I think they're equally possible theories. But I do think that science can answer these questions. obviously there are studies that go both ways, but I do think you can do meta-analyses that will show a trend in one direction or the other. So I wouldn't be as negative on the possibilities of science to sort this.
No, if I can say, and I love, one of the things that I love about our differences is that there's a very, we come from very different backgrounds in terms of like academic backgrounds. I mean, also, et cetera. My focus, honestly, one of the reasons why I'm also reluctant to answer these questions is that my focus is like, I don't care what the data show. What I care about is the following. If any one of you women in this audience want to become president of a university, you should damn well be able to. And there should not be anything that is...
We have children, right? This is the big, I'm sorry, you talked about a big white elephant in the room. And the big white elephant in the room that you keep avoiding is the fact that, and I come from a corporate background and people in corporate backgrounds. We don't want to be there because we want to have children. If somebody asks me, what is the meaning of life? I would say my children. Just let me finish. And so, ignoring that fact and saying, well, it's because they were treated a certain way or they had bad experiences is completely devaluing a beautiful decision that women make that, you know what, to Eric's point, I don't want to be 80-hour work weeks. I want to be home with my kids, taking them to the playground to see the solar eclipse or just hanging out for the day. And that is a valid decision. So by ignoring it, you're in the effort to be inclusive, you're actually excluding one of the most beautiful vocations that women can choose.
So I appreciate that, and I think that the only thing that I would suggest is that I did not exclude your point of view. I said something very specific. I said, if a woman wants to do that, and let me tell you something, I know a lot of women that either want to have children and be CEOs, or that don't want to have children and still be CEOs. And I also happen to know that there are a lot of women who criticize women who have this point of view. And all I'm saying is that if you want to have children, then my suggestion would be the government should be more responsive to people like yourself and should give you the support that you need to be able to live the life that you want to live. And if that's what you want to do, or if you don't want to, that's great. But what I'm telling you is that there are women, and I've known a lot of them, who actually do have that desire. And all I'm saying...
And it's probably the 23%.
So then let me give you a slightly more clear answer, because I thought that it was clear, but I'm going to be more clear. I believe that any person that has an objective for their career and their personal life should be able to pursue that objective without having interference that has nothing to do with their ability or their desire to do that, and it only has to do with their gender, their race, their disabilities. That's all I'm saying. So now, I'm not saying that everybody, like for example, the idea that every woman, like that there should be 50-50 CEOs, I don't agree with that. That there should be 50-50 firemen, I don't agree with that. That every woman should want to have a full-time career, I don't agree with that. But I also don't agree that every woman should stay home and decide that having children is the most wonderful thing on the planet. What I'm saying...
That's what I said, but you're saying that there's a big difference between this level of an organization and the top level of the organization. And you're attributing it to experiences, prejudice, unconscious bias, whatever it is. And all I'm saying is if you do not acknowledge that many women will choose to stay home or go part-time or take a more junior position so they can be at home, then your numbers are faulty.
Well...
You have a faulty assumption.
Well...
That's about who defines success.
It's... Okay. Yeah, okay. We can continue the conversation, but that's fine.
I don't want to hijack it, but that is a faulty assumption in my view.
Okay, let's move on. I'm going to exercise a little of my own preferences here, cherry pick some questions. If 100 people cannot define inclusion or equity, is it possible the problem is with the ideas in the first place? And I guess that, if I can editorialize, if you two do have different definitions and there are other definitions, what does that reflect?
I mean, I think the easy answer to the question is yes. I think that's actually a fundamental problem is that, and I've seen interesting studies in which you put people together that are using the same language and they think they mean the same thing and they really don't. And I think that's a profound problem. One of the things that I try to do is that I try to come up with definitions, which I always tell people, these are my own definitions. They're based on my research. They're based on my studies. They're convenient because they reflect things that I can measure. And so that's but I also realize that that's not right, and I realize that you're absolutely right. I think there's a huge problem with the fact that the terms inclusion, the terms equity, even the term diversity mean different things to different people. And I think that that's true of a lot of the terms that you're using as well. They mean different things to different people, and that's a problem.
Yeah, and I would just add, though, it is interesting that, a lot of the things that you talk about are very practical ideas, good ideas, and yet the amount of attention to them that is paid to them is much less than the effort that's been put into, as you say, quotas, hitting quotas, dragging people through diversity training that we know, and David Haskell is here, has shown very clearly these things do not work. There's no evidence they work. The number of diversity bureaucrats that are hired. It seems like the political and financial energy and the emotional energy is all going towards things that are effectively useless, and a lot of which you say is useless. And that needs an explanation. For example, why aren't feminists really pushing for longer maternity leave? It strikes me living in Europe and seeing that it's more generous maternity leave there. I just can't understand why in North America that's not the main focus of feminism. But yet, no, it's all got to be on quotas and timetables. So it strikes me that the political and ideological side of this is something, and that's not your business, not your wheelhouse, but I just think it's a very important context. That's what's providing the energy, the intolerance, the drive in DEI bureaucracies, for example, and it's just, I think it's a problem, and it really needs to be rolled back. But that doesn't mean that your ideas shouldn't come into practice, because these two things are compatible, but this overwhelming religion of anti-racism and so on is just so powerful. Anyway.
Okay, I'm conscious of the time, and there's another class in here at 6. That's not true. There's no class in here at 6. So I want to cherry pick one more for each of you, both of you, to take a turn at. What's the fundamental moral value underlying EDI? It's an easy one to close with.
So I think in a way this is a perfect segue to what you were just saying. So first of all, I don't think that there is such a thing as a monolithic underlying ideal. In fact, by the way, one of the things that I do object to in some of the things that I've heard is this idea that DI, sometimes it's called de-ideology, right? It's like there are people, and unfortunately those are the most vocal people. They're the ones that most people who are not steeped in DI are most likely to hear. And those people do things that not only do I agree with you are actually not particularly useful, but I think they're also very counterproductive. I think that a lot of the backlash is because of that. I wrote an article in 2018 in Forbes, so it's in black on white. Otherwise, I almost didn't believe in myself because I never guessed the future. But in 2018, April, I wrote an article in which I said companies need to stop focusing on diversity. And I said, if they keep focusing just on representation and diversity, two things will happen. One, it will create backlash with white men that will complain about reverse discrimination. And this might spread to other parts of society, like affirmative action. Like I wrote this in 2018. Okay, so I firmly believe that treating DEI as a religious, ideological, absolute that has its own value and its own definition, in my opinion, is a mistake. Now, I think I understand why people do that. And I think it has to do with the fact that back in the 1960s, after civil rights, because a lot of this is grounded in race. I mean, there was, in the United States, there are some massive, massive issues still today, but a lot of it was grounded back then. And so what happened is that people, as they entered the workforce and they found that they were treated like crap, and they were not advancing, they were not giving opportunities, they were not getting hired, they knew that something was wrong, but the only thing they could measure was diversity. So diversity became the torch, and everybody started to use that. And in my opinion, that's like the thermostat. You're looking at the wrong thing. You're looking at the outcome. And then, as you said, then people talk about structural disparities. Well, what is a structural disparity? If it's just what you're measuring, then it's circular. But you can't put a finger on it because structural disparity is not, again, it's not that the door is closed when you're trying to come into the building. So do I think, I would never want to try to tell you what are the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because I can tell you that, again, there too, a lot of people will give you different ideas. I think ultimately, what a lot of people want is to can I please do my work and not be shat on because of the fact that I'm black or gay or have a disability? I think that's really ultimately what people want. And honestly, that you want if you want to have a life where you're able to, your greatest pleasure is to have children, that's great. You should be able to do that. Nobody should come to you and say, no, you cannot do that. because of some DEI ideology that says that you all need to become department chairs. Okay, but conversely, right? So again, I try to avoid these things. I try to just be pragmatic and say, okay, let's measure the data. Let's find where there is a problem. If 100 people are complaining about this, here's some suggestion of why you might want to fix it. And then if you fix it or not, it's your choice, right? But ultimately, so again, I try to avoid these big ideological things and really focus on let's make things work a little bit better. So.
Okay.
I think there was a different question for you.
Was it a different question?
Same question.
Same
Same
question.
okay.
So yeah, I mean, I think this is a deeply moral, DEI is heavily, as I mentioned, implicated in the kind of ideological developments post-1960s on the left. The left has pivoted away from class towards identity. And that's not just the radical left, but the liberal left. That's what I point out in my book. I really try and focus on the liberal left, which is a much larger group that believes, compassion, guilt around my historically disadvantaged race, gender, and sexual identity groups, and this overriding fear of the majority. That's really what forms that left liberal outlook. It's been extremely powerful. It accounts for speech codes, for affirmative action. This is a religious, moral, ideological movement that provides a lot of meaning for a lot of people. For them, that's what being a good person is about, is I'm an anti-racist. I support minority groups, and I am opposed to majority groups, and that is what it means to be virtuous. It's what Jonathan Haidt really identifies as those two moral foundations, the Care, Harm, and Equality Foundation, and those are the driver. Now, and that's why I think it's just impossible to ignore that context. Why is a book as in many ways as weakly researched as the work of Robin DiAngelo or Ibram X. Kendi, and why are they selling millions of copies? I mean, this is hugely influential, and I guess that's maybe where. Now, I'm sure there are some DEI practitioners who just want to improve results, but I also think that a lot of people are swept up in these ideological narratives, and they're very powerful. So I guess I see it as a profoundly moral movement, and not really a movement that arises just from these kind of practical difficulties, even though I understand that too is a part of it. But I think it's inseparable from the history of the left post-1960s.
Well, okay, that was fantastic. I'm sorry to have disappointed you all with such reasonable speakers at this event. This didn't go the way I expected. None of the senior executives of either university are attending today because they're at an anti-racism event at the University of Waterloo. Interesting coincidence. I just mentioned that as an aside. Thank you all for fabulous questions. We couldn't get to all of them. It was largely based on popular vote and a little bit of me. I'm going to turn it over to Michael Pavlin to make some closing remarks.
Okay. Thank you, Will. I'm the third co-chair. I'm a professor here in the business school, or an associate professor. As Jeff mentioned at the beginning, what we hope differentiates this event and Laurier HXA in general from other going-ons on campus is this willingness, which I think was really exemplified today, to engage in an honest and charitable manner with our intellectual counterparts and find common ground, and to do so with evidence, which is an odd thing to see on a campus these days in certain contexts. Anyways, I'd like to thank Paolo and Eric for exemplifying this HXA way, and this wasn't a debate. There's no winners and losers. Rather, what we've seen here are arguments and evidence that you guys take home with you. I hope you'll continue to engage with these questions, with the rationales, the arguments, and come to your own humble conclusions. And I guess as a final point, I'd just like to give the speakers the opportunity to maybe give us a final take-home message, a little takeaway. So maybe Paolo, I'll ask you to go first if you have anything that you'd like to share.
No, I mean, I think it's been, first of all, great. Thank you for the opportunity. I do hope that people realize that, yes, there's a lot of things that have been done, in my opinion, incorrectly in terms of how EDI, DEI, whatever you want to call it, has been promoted. But I do ask for one thing. We're all very smart people. We're all very intelligent people. And one thing that I find frustrating sometimes is we're very intelligent people, spend their energy trying to counter things instead of trying to find solutions. So my goal is to find solutions. I'm an engineer at heart. I like to fix things. So what I would invite some of you to do is, if you really don't like the way that things are going, instead of just spending time and energy coming up with reasons for why it's all screwed up, see if you can help to figure out a solution. See if you can help to, come up with ways that might actually make things better for yourself and for everybody else. And if part of that is dismantling the current EDI structures, et cetera, great, so be it. But I just would like to see a bit more constructivism and a little bit less, let's burn things down in flame.
Right. So I guess my view is really that a lot of these questions are foundational for our civilization, and to what extent, and we face a choice, really. I think, to what extent are we going to prioritize, say, Enlightenment values, free speech, equal treatment, objective truth, due process, for example, or are we going to prioritize values of cultural socialism around equal outcomes by identity group and emotional harm protection? If we want to go the so-called social justice route, that's fine, but I think we will be a changed civilization, and I think cultural and human flourishing will suffer as a result. But I think Paolo makes a good point in that we should be able to come up with some positive solutions. One of the things I've wondered, and you'll know more about this than I, is this question of whether we can kind of raise the weak or the marginalized, if you like, rather than trying to knock down the strong groups that are overrepresented. I don't know enough about this, but for example, can we devise forms of CBT that can deal with imposter syndrome, that can deal with